"This just in!" Barbara Jean shouted, ignoring him. "There's a cold front coming through, and it's going to linger." Reba watched them, a familiar sense of amusement and exhaustion washing over her. Her ex-husband was married to a weather girl who used her glutes as a barometer. Her son-in-law was her professional rival. Her daughter was a reformed B-word. And her youngest son had briefly been a wheelchair basketball star. She looked at her family, gathered in the living room, bickering and laughing and surviving. She picked up her glass of iced tea and stepped out onto the porch. The Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. "I'm a survivor," she whispered to the wind. And for the first time in a long time, Reba Hart knew that even if the sailing wasn't smooth, she was more than capable of steering the ship. Chapter 8. The Velvet Prison of Norris Realty. Van Montgomery had never imagined that moving up would feel so much like moving into a hospital. The office at Norris Realty was a masterpiece of chrome, glass, and silent carpets. There were no children's drawings on the fridge, no smell of burnt toast, and certainly no Reba Hart shouting about idiots from the next room. Steve Norris, a man whose teeth were so white they seemed to glow in the dark, greeted Van with a handshake that felt like it had been practiced in a mirror. "Welcome to the big leagues, kid," Steve said, handing Van a key fob. "Your chariot awaits." The chariot was a charcoal gray SUV with seats that indeed felt like a warm hug. For the first hour, Van was in heaven. He drove around Houston, adjusting the lumbar support and occasionally talking to the voice-activated navigation system just because he could. But by the third day, the velvet prison began to close in. Van sat in his glass cubicle, staring at a spreadsheet of corporate relocations. He missed the closer stare. He missed the way Reba would roll her eyes when he suggested horseback riding to an open house. Here, everyone spoke in synergy and market penetration. He took a break to call Cheyenne, but she was in the middle of a prenatal yoga for sanity class. "I'm a corporate shark, Cheyenne," Van whispered to his phone in the hallway, "but I feel more like a goldfish in a very expensive, very sterile tank." Back in the Reba Hart Realty world, which currently consisted of Reba's kitchen table and a slightly temperamental fax machine, the silence was deafening. Reba sat alone, trying to organize the half list they had agreed upon. Every time the door creaked, she expected to see a giant in a too small basketball uniform. Instead, it was just the wind or a stray cat. She was a solo agent again, and for the first time in her life, she realized that having a knucklehead as a partner was better than having no partner at all. Chapter 9. The Rise of the Buttrometer. While Van was suffocating in luxury, Barbara Jean was taking over Houston's cable airwaves. Stormy Clearweather had become an overnight sensation. It turned out that people didn't want meteorological data. They wanted a middle-aged woman in a bright yellow raincoat who predicted thunderstorms based on how much her metal stud-scarred glutes tingled. The ratings for Channel 34 spiked. Barbara Jean was recognized at the grocery store. People would walk up to her and ask, "Is it gonna drizzle, Stormy?" And she would do a little wiggle and give them a wink. "Brock, look at this fan mail," Barbara Jean squealed, dumping a pile of letters onto their coffee table. "Someone sent me a bedazzler. They want me to sparkle like a hurricane." Brock Hart, a man who had spent his career as a dentist trying to project an aura of professional calm, was falling apart. He was now Mr. Stormy Clearweather. Patients in his chair would ask if he knew what the humidity was going to be before they let him drill. "Honey, it's great that you're successful," Brock said, his voice strained. "But do you have to do the butt wiggle in every segment? It's hard to maintain a dignified practice when my wife is the super buttrometer." "You're just threatened by my career, Brock," Barbara Jean retorted, her chin trembling. "You want me back in the kitchen, making bran cakes." But Stormy is meant to soar. The tension in the Brock-Barbara Jean household was reaching a boiling point, and as always, the overflow spilled into Reba's life. Barbara Jean showed up on Reba's porch at midnight, wearing her Stormy Clearweather raincoat and carrying a suitcase. "Reba, he doesn't understand my art," she wailed. Reba looked at the woman who was her best friend and her greatest headache. "It's a performance, Reba, and my butt is the star." Reba sighed and opened the door. Fine. But if you start tingling in my guest room, I'm calling a priest. Chapter 10. The High-Stakes Duel. The truce between Reba and Van was finally tested when the Miller estate went on the market. The Miller estate was the holy grail of Houston residential real estate, a sprawling colonial on 5 acres with a commission that could pay for a year of college. Both Reba and Norris Realty were invited to pitch for the listing. Reba arrived at the Miller mansion in her trusty station wagon, her briefcase full of handwritten notes and neighborhood history. She was ready. She was the veteran. And then, the charcoal gray SUV pulled up. Van stepped out, wearing a suit that actually fit him, followed by Steve Norris. They had a digital presentation, a drone video of the property, and a marketing plan that involved a 3-page spread in Luxury Homes Monthly. Mrs. H., Van said, looking genuinely pained as they met in the driveway. I didn't know you were pitching this one. Neither did I. Van, Reba said, her voice steady but her heart sinking. But may the best corporate shark win. Inside the Grand Library, the duel began. Steve Norris spoke of global reach and wealth tech integration. Reba spoke of the Miller's children growing up in that house, of the secret to getting the fireplace to draw properly, and of her 30 years of knowing every stone in that zip code. Van sat quietly, watching Reba. When it was over, the Millers asked for a moment to deliberate. In the hallway, Steve Norris patted Van on the back. We've got this, kid. Her pitch was folksy. People don't want folksy for a $10 million estate. They want results. Van looked at Reba, who was standing by the window, looking out at the gardens. You what, Steve? Van said, his voice suddenly loud in the quiet hallway. She's not folksy. She's the real deal. And if I'm the better realtor because I have a fancy car and a drone, then I don't want to be a realtor at all. He walked over to Reba. Mrs. H., I'm quitting. What? Now? Van, we're in the middle of a pitch. I don't care. I miss the carpool lane. Reba looked at him, and for the second time that month, she felt like she might cry. You're a moron, Van. I know, he grinned. But I'm your moron. The Millers walked back in. We've made our decision, Mrs. Miller said. Steve Norris sputtered. But they aren't a firm anymore. They are now, Reba said, grabbing Van's arm. And we're taking the drone with us. Chapter 11. The Survivor's Sunset. The Houston heat was starting to break as autumn teased the horizon. The Hart family was gathered in the backyard for a celebratory barbecue. Van was back at the kitchen table, his Hart and Montgomery business cards sitting in a proud stack. Cheyenne was laughing as Elizabeth tried to feed a hot dog to the dog. Kira was playing a demo of her band's new song on a boombox. And even Brock and Barbara Jean had made up, mostly because Stormy Clearweather had decided to retire and become a climate awareness influencer, which involved fewer butt wiggles and more recycled fashion. Reba stood by the grill, flipping burgers and watching the chaos. She thought about the smooth sailing she had craved so much at the beginning of the summer. She realized now that smooth sailing was boring. It was the storms, the rebellions, the frauds, the professional wars, and the midnight suitcase arrivals that made the journey worth taking. She looked at her kids, her ex-husband, her crazy friend, and the son-in-law who had chosen family over a heated seat. Hey, Mom, Cheyenne called out. Are the burgers done? They're getting there, honey, Reba shouted back. Just like the rest of us. She took a sip of her iced tea and smiled at the setting sun. The going good blues were gone. There was only the going forward rhythm of a life well lived. She was a single mom who worked too hard. She was a partner who had found her match. She was a survivor. And, as the stars began to poke through the Texas sky, Reba Hart knew that as long as they were all together, they could handle whatever the weather or the buttrometer predicted. Chapter 12. The Drone of Domesticity. The drone, a high-tech piece of surveillance equipment that Steve Norris had intended for filming luxury estates, had found a new, decidedly less professional purpose in the Hart Montgomery household. Van sat on the sofa, a VR headset strapped to his face, his thumbs twitching over the controls. Van, what are you doing? Cheyenne asked, waddling into the living room. Her belly was now a formidable sphere, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying a bowl of soup that was filled to the absolute brim. "I'm monitoring the perimeter. Cheyenne," Van's muffled voice came from beneath the headset. "Elizabeth is in the backyard. I'm making sure she doesn't eat any more of those suspicious-looking berries. She's with Mom, Van. She's fine. The drone provides a tactical advantage. Look, I just found Henry's lost soldier in the gutter. And, oh, hey, the Johnsons next door are having a really tense conversation about their lawnmower." Reba walked in, holding a screaming Elizabeth. "Van, take that thing off. The humming is driving the dog crazy, and I'm pretty sure you're violating several local ordinances and at least one international treaty on privacy."